Welcome, everyone. Here we are at the second session of the European Conference, which is Poetics and Politics of Digitization, Constructing Collections and Social Impact. I'm Robin Boast. I'm the Professor of Cultural Information Science in Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam. I'm also a proud member of the European Research Advisory Board, as is one of our other committee members, one of our other speakers. I'd like to welcome all of the attendees from wherever you are in the world. I noticed from our previous one that people were really scattered all over the world, and that was very nice. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to basically dive into the questions, but I'm into the speakers. But may I ask, please, for the attendees to, at any time you wish, to submit a question via Q&A, because that allows me to go through. I'm afraid I'm going to have to curate the questions and choose just a few because we won't have that much time. But if you submit your questions through Q&A, I'll be able to go through there and choose questions for each speaker. So may I now introduce, quite happily, Rossitza Atanassova, who's the digital curator at the British Library. The British Library, I hope most of you know, has been one of the more innovative sites of digitization and digital work in curation over the last 20, 30 years at least, probably much longer. So I'm looking forward to Rossitza's talk, which is Contextualizing Digital Cultural Heritage. That's a bit general, but she's informed me that she's actually speaking about the context of the library's digitization program, the challenges of prioritizing what to digitize, and some of the ways that the British Library is doing this. So I turn the floor over to you, Rossitza.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Robin. Good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be speaking today, and thank you for inviting me to speak. The British Library is the National Library of the United Kingdom, and our mission is to make intellectual heritage accessible to everyone for research, inspiration, and enjoyment. And as Robin said, I will talk briefly about the context of digitizing collections at the British Library and encouraging use of these collections. So the British Library has been involved with digitization since the late 90s, digitizing some of our most important treasures, particularly illuminated manuscripts to start with, and then had undertaken mass digitization of historical newspapers and printed books, and digitizing collections that are of particular importance to researchers, often in partnership with other organizations and with philanthropic donations. To name a few examples, we currently have a project, an ongoing partnership with the Qatar Foundation and National Library to digitize records from our archives, maps, manuscripts relating to the Gulf and the wider region. We had a collaboration with National Library of Singapore in the last few years with generous funding from the Bollinger family. We had funding from the Polonsky Foundation to digitize our entire collection of Hebrew manuscripts and medieval manuscripts, which we did in partnership with the National Library of France. The library has many ongoing successful public-private partnerships to create more digital primary sources to support research, teaching, learning, family history. And for example, we've had a partnership with Google to digitize books, and we've just hit the 600,000 milestone, 600,000 volumes available for people to enjoy. And we have had a very successful partnership with a company called Find My Past to digitize so far over 40 million pages of historical newspapers from the library's holdings. And apologies, I forgot that I had some slides to share. So I'm just going to share my presentation. I just launched in. I'm just going to start here. However, having said that background, we still have very large gaps to fill in our digital offering, especially as the scale of our collection is vast. We've got over 150 million items, and you can have a separate conversation about one counts as an item. So to address the gaps and to begin thinking more strategically about digitization, in 2017, the library launched the Heritage Made Digital program to ensure that what we digitize reflects the breadth of the library's collections. Heritage Made Digital takes into account both institutional and user needs, as well as those of our partners and funders, and has funded some new digitization, most recently of 16th century historical English documents, rare incunabula, over 400 incunabula from our collection, and manuscripts from Ethiopia. The program also prioritizes for digitization collections that are in poor, vulnerable condition to make them more easily accessible to everyone online, and also collections for which we know there is demand from users. For example, 19th century newspapers, shorter runs, about 200 titles of 19th century newspapers, which complement the offering through our commercial partnership. More importantly, we want digitized content to be more easily accessible and where permissible reused as widely as possible for research, learning, creatively, for trialing new technology and methodology. Our digitization policy defines clear cutoff dates to help selection of out of copyright content. For example, for the newspaper digitization program, we've got a 140-year rule to select newspapers that we believe are out of copyright and for which we have done due diligence. We also have a well-established internal process for attributing open licenses to content where copyright has expired or has been waived. And here I have a little note that copyright regimes change. So since the exit of the UK from the European Union, we've had to take down a particular resource, which we digitized back in 2015, the Spare Rib magazine, feminist magazine published between 1972 and 1990s, because the copyright framework we used for that particular project was based on the the EU Orphan Works Directive. So we wanted to make that resource available. We did make it available, but now we've had to take it down. It was published by JISC. To move on, more of our digital collections are being made available on our strategic viewer for digitized content. It's a viewer which complies with the IIIF standard. This is the International Image Interoperability Framework standard. This offers an enhanced user experience through high resolution viewing, browsing, searching of our printed texts, OCR printed text, downloading, and particularly sharing and embedding digitized content. The platform will be used also for playing sound and displaying 3D images, for example, some of our collection of digitized globes. Over the last decade, digitization has driven research and innovation, and library staff contributes to many research projects which use the outputs of digitization. The British Library Labs competitions and awards in particular have stimulated hundreds of academic, computational, artistic, educational, and community projects using libraries' digitized collections. And it has developed a service for supporting all kinds of digital research. You can find examples of these projects on our website. Digitized data, images, text, descriptive metadata are also made available to download from the research repository. This is our open data. Unfortunately, the research repository is temporarily out of action. It's unavailable due to platform migration, but I've included the link on the slide, iro.bl.uk. There we've published a lot of data sets and derived data from digitization projects that are available for reuse with open licenses. BL Labs code and documentation is also available on GitHub. Digitized images and text are used as training data to automate transcription of text for non-Western languages, and also for complex layout analysis. For example, complex printed tabular content, Arabic manuscripts that we've digitized in our collection. The one particularly good example is the 2 Centuries of Indian Print project, which has been digitizing collections in South Asian languages, printed books printed in South Asia. And the project team and the curator, Tom Derrick, used a software called Transcribus to automate transcriptions of digitized Bengali books and shared those transcriptions on Wikisource recently, asking the community to proofread them. These and other projects at the library are involved with creating training data and using the help of the wider community to crowdsource information and improve metadata for our digital collections. Research collaborations help us become more transparent about the process of digitization, as well as improve knowledge about our collections. One example is the Living with Machines project, a big collaboration between several HE institutions, the Alan Turing Institute and the British Library, which applies data science and artificial intelligence to digitized archives in order to facilitate new historical findings about the effects of the mechanization of labor on the lives of ordinary people in the long 19th century. The project had funding to digitize 19th century newspapers, as well as other collections at the library, in particular maps and official publications. And to understand better and assist the selection of newspaper titles for digitization for this particular project, and selection for newspaper digitization is particularly complex because of the metadata, the different media on which the information is held, microfilm, print, newspaper titles changing. Because of all the complexities and to understand better the process and to help us improve our process of selection, the team led by Olivia Vane created a visualization tool, which is called the Press Picker, which helped us select the newspapers and help the researchers working on the project understand what was in the library collection, what had been digitized, what they needed to digitize for the project. This tool, for which the code has been published by the Living with Machines project on their blog post on their website, and I've included the link, will support work at the library and support future research projects. So it's really helping us address some of the operational challenges around digitization. And just to mention that annually the library publishes research reports, and here you can see our research collaborations during 2018-19, and it highlights the range and international breadth of our research collaborations to address improve our digitized content and engage with wider audiences. Our mission is to share cultural heritage with all, and the library is trying to reach new and wider audiences. We want to ensure that our digitization is inclusive and digitization is representative of the breadth of the collection, as I've already mentioned, and includes different formats, text, but also audio, visual materials, languages, represents different languages and cultures. Publishing digitized images on Flickr and Wikimedia, in particular Wikicommons and Wikidata, have meant wider engagement with digital collections. For example, our images on Flickr have been viewed over 1 billion times since 2013, and the latest collection of over 17,000 maps and topographical views from the collection of King George III has had 20 million views since the images were first published in October last year, with 10 million views in the first 2 months. We have also just welcomed our second Wikipedian in residence at the library, Lucy Hinney, who is working with curators and the wider community to increase engagement with our digital collections. She's currently supporting activities of the IFLA Wikidata working group to create a capability within the GLAM sector for using Wikidata. And last but not least, the library's anti-racism project has given structure to many collection management activities, such as reviewing cataloging standards, problematic terminology, headings, and will ensure even greater fairness and diversity in our digitization work. So thank you for your attention, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Very good timers. Thank you very much. Yes, please stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
We can move on. Anyway, we'll move on. The next person, I will not embarrass him by telling you how long we've known each other. It's been a long time. That says a lot about how old both of us are. Seamus Ross, who's the professor in the Faculty of Information, ex-dean at the University of Toronto and another member of the European Research Advisory Board. He's going to be speaking about a very exciting topic, at least something close to my heart, which is reinforcing traditional cultural attitudes and ways of knowing in memory institutions through digital privileging. Seamus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a pleasure to be here and to be taking part in this event. My choice of topic reflects the fact that I am deeply concerned about the way current digitization practices reinforce traditional cultural attitudes and ways of knowing. So nothing about the cultural heritage is benign. Even our definitions of what is cultural heritage are shaped by prevailing social attitudes, behaviors, dominant and predominantly Western ways of knowing and representing knowledge, and other factors such as current power and gender politics. Cultural heritage institutions, as reflections not merely of the content they hold, but of the people who work in them and the society in which they exist, are tainted in similar ways. As a result, our definitions of cultural heritage are in flux and emergent. Generally, what we consider cultural heritage to be is shaped by the institutions that curate the material and the funders who support those activities. Digitization has been the focus of activity for more than 4 decades in the cultural sector. Pioneering projects such as the Archival de Indias project, the British Library's Beowulf manuscript digitization project, or the digitization of artifacts recovered during the All-American Pipeline project, contended with technical limitations in terms of digitization quality, storage, and processing speed, lack of standards, poor understanding of workflow, and challenges providing potential users with access to the resources that have been created. These projects were superseded by larger scale initiatives over the next 3 decades. So this created a vast array of online content for researchers, educators, and the general public. For instance, the National Archives of Scotland began in 2000 a 4-year collaboration with what was then the Genealogical Society of Utah to digitize some 520,000 surviving wills and testaments, quote, registered in the Scottish commissary courts and sheriff courts from 1500 to 1901, end quote. A massive undertaking which pushed the boundaries of technology and practice. In fact, as one of the project monitors for the funder, who is the Heritage Lottery Fund, I had my doubts about the viability of the project, but the project designer and manager, Rob Mildren, made it possible by some very imaginative reworking of workflows, definition of cutting-edge digitization stations, and very creative information system designs. 40 years on from those early projects, nearly all cultural heritage institutions are engaged in one way or another in projects to improve curation and access to their holdings through digitization. If we did not realize the centrality of digitization to making accessible the cultural narrative before COVID, it's hard now not to appreciate the critical role that digitization plays in unlocking our cultural resources and making them accessible. When we think cultural heritage, our views tend to be constrained by the historically narrow perspective of national, regional, and civic institutions from galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll constrain ourselves to archives and archival material. But as you will, I hope, see, this argument could be applied to the cultural heritage more generally. More recently, emerging institutions such as community archives, or what Abigail de Kosnik in her 2016 monograph called Rogue Archives, or what Shauna Moore and Susan Pell describe as autonomous archives, are challenging the dominance of the traditional. In these archives, we see new kinds of content and new kinds of community participation and action. These archives, as Moore and Pell explain, quote, have the potential to affect public memory and history more generally through introduction of new and alternative narratives, end quote. Through filling out and broadening the nature and kinds of materials preserved, these archives are enabling new kinds of research, remixing, and social justice. What traditional institutions and emerging ones have in common is that they all have collecting practices that are shaped by their own mandates and policies. These provide them with boundaries. Numerous thinkers, including Barbara Craig, Terry Eastwood, Daniel Labrage, and the late Michael Moss, and many others, have drawn our attention to how these mandates and policies which shape collecting are socially constructed. As the Dutch archivist and thinker Eric Kedelaar put it in 2001, archives have tacit narratives in the materials they hold, how they organize that material, how they describe them, how they provide access to them. To understand archives, we must, in his words, interrogate the archive's semantic genealogy. Kimberly Belmonte and Susan Opto, writing in 2017 in the journal Qualitative Psychology on a study of 5 archival collections, some in traditional institutions and others in community archives, summarized the position by, quote, discussing archiving as an activity, a social practice focused on meaningful objects as mediated by prevailing socio-political dynamics. Belmonte and Opto argue that there are 3 kinds of social justice at play in archives, and with which archivists must engage. These are procedural, distributive, and inclusionary. They argue that the concept of procedural justice informs fairness of rules, policies, and procedures, quote, that guide the work of the archivist, and as a result, quote, procedurally just archives ensure that the collection represents a society's social issues as they affect diverse populations. Distributive justice demands, quote, in their words, equitable allocation of resources across holdings and support for a variety of uses and users. And finally, for them, inclusionary justice in this context is, quote, attentive to others' entitlement to justice, and therefore encourages collection building, which is representative and, quote, inclusive, end quote. We see these kinds of justice at work in archival appraisal, the process by which materials are selected for inclusion in archives. As the late Terry Cook, a towering intellectual figure in archival thinking in a 2001 essay, explained, appraisal aims to identify records that most clearly reveal the nature of society, the dynamics of government and other institutions, the lives of ordinary people, and the prevailing ideological currents of the age, to transcend narrow legal or research interests and to instead document the broad spectrum of human experience, end quote. Archives do this within the context, again, of policy and mandate. A key role of cultural heritage institutions is to develop descriptions of entities and their care that can be accessible through catalogs or finding aids. Cultural heritage institutions describe for many reasons, including establishing statements of what they hold, providing a frame for knowing what is where, and as a way to enable users to discover material in collections. These descriptions, like the archives themselves, are social constructions. And as Beth Yackel argued, quote, archival representation processes are neither objective nor transparent, end quote. In fact, she concludes that, quote, it is these representations that may be the most enduring evidence of the archivist, end quote. Nothing about archival practice is benign. In the way they mediate between the collection and the user, these descriptions shape dominant modes of discourse by providing us with information about the content, form, and pragmatics, that is the context and process by which the documents were created and used. So what does archival work, archival construction, archival description have to do with digitization? First, in selecting materials for digitization, archives and cultural institutions in general tend to reinforce existing narratives, as the narratives they can create with digitization are often constrained by the very nature of the collections they hold, how they are arranged, and how they are described. Digitization consumes scarce resources, and current technologies limits what can be digitized and made accessible. The very technologies and processes of digitization reshape in many ways the very nature of the material and the kinds of interconnections and relationships which arise from them, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. When we consider digitization, we would argue the digitization initiatives should commence with an analysis of holdings and strategic planning of digital collection development on institutional, regional, national, and even international levels. These should be built on source-oriented reviews of collections and thoughtful analysis of what materials users might want to work with and how through digitization collections can be made accessible to marginalized populations for purposes of social activism, identity, definition, remixing, and reconciliation. But after considering Belmonte and Opto's work, after considering Belmonte and Opto's work, we would argue that in planning digitization initiatives, we have to be cognizant of the ways in which procedural, distributive, and inclusionary behaviors in the definitions of these programs can shape the ways in which they promote and shape and impact social justice. There are other issues here. For example, huge ethical issues. And sadly, time does not permit me to engage here with the ethical aspects to digitization. But I would encourage you to read the exceptionally fine 2017 essay on the topic by Zenaida Mansuch, that's M-A-N-Z-U-C-H, called Ethical Issues in Digitization of Cultural Heritage. So what can we do about all these aspects of social construction and constraints on what is digitized and what it actually means for society? First, cultural institutions need to focus on their policy frameworks, governing not just collecting, but digitization and the ways in which digital content is made accessible to users to ensure that these policies are socially inclusive, support diverse storytelling, and look beyond dominant narratives to the marginalized and the other. Second, cultural networks and funders must see beyond the traditional archival bodies and more broadly support digitization initiatives by emergent archives. Those are the rogue archives or the autonomous archives of Moore and Pell. Third, institutions should take a lesson from the open data movement and avoid putting paywalls between their digitized content and their users. These paywalls disenfranchise. Fourth, in organizing and planning digitization programs, it is essential that we focus also on educating our users to paraphrase Lowen and Rosenberg, to read the digital archive itself, or to take a phrase from Catalar to allow us to understand its semantic genealogy. Fifth, digitization programs need to reflect fair and care principles in the design, functioning, rollout, and description of materials. And finally, building on the ideas of Belmonte and Opto, digitization programs must, if they are to have an impact on social justice, reflect equitable procedural, distributive, and inclusionary practices. This is the only way that we can move beyond reinforcing traditional behaviors, traditional knowledge, ways of knowing in our digitization programs. And to be a creator of social justice, we must move beyond reinforcing traditional narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus. Massive amount of food for thought there. I think we have a lot of questions coming in for both speakers, so that's very good. And we'll get on to that at the end with more discussion. I'd like to move on to our next panelist, someone I've also known for a long time, Heidi Geismar. We were together at Cambridge, followed her stellar career from NYU, now a professor of anthropology at University of College London, which she's been for some years. And her talk is Social Media, the Next Ethnographic Collection. So Heidi.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this great panel. I'm learning a lot already. I'm going to read, so if I'm looking down, that's why I've had the fear of the 12 minutes, so I'm trying to keep to time. So in this very brief talk, I lay down a kind of provocation, thinking about the future of the ethnographic collection by looking at it through the lens of social media and vice versa. As we're all very much aware, the affordances and promises of digital media have fully impacted all areas of museum practice. So here I'm talking more about museums than archives, but it might be worth unpacking both the similarities and differences in our discussion. And these promises of digital media are now crucial to the management of stakeholder and public relations, and are also an important part of vernacular cultural production almost everywhere in the world, from the Amazon rainforest through to the Australian bush. At the same time, we're in a moment of intense critique and reflection of the history and legacy of ethnographic and colonial collections. So by wondering if social media might be the next kind of ethnographic collection, I propose that the reckoning with difficult histories and power imbalances within ethnographic collections be channeled not just to the past, but also to be channeled as a mode of continued reflection on the future of museums and collections. Here, there's much to be gained, in Donna Haraway's words, with staying with the trouble, applying the lens of a kind of contemporary critical museum anthropology that has focused not simply on the collection and exhibition of material in museums, but on the structures of power, colonial histories and legacies, and social and political relations that these collections engender to our contemporary relationship with digital culture and practices of digitization. And perhaps paradoxically, I also propose we take seriously the analytic issues raised by social media, questions of scale, of the everyday, of normativity, class, and language, as well as of corporate control and surveillance. And we take all of these seriously as an important heuristic to understand contemporary collecting in collecting institutions. I'm thinking about museums. I think there are very instructive similarities between the intention to kind of collect or capture the world as a driving logic that underpins social media, as well as the ethnographic collection historically. Just like the digital algorithms of Google or Facebook, the museum collecting and archiving practices that emerged from the Enlightenment onwards, and which were particularly extended around the world during the age of European imperialism, they explicitly intended to capture the world through comparative and schematic representation, but then recursively built upon itself to constitute a truth claim about the nature of culture. In turn, the classifications and categories that structured these collections arose from very material engagements with things, as well as from the ideologies and discourses that surrounded them, powerfully inflected by the global political economy of colonial appropriation. And whilst there's a good deal of work, of contemporary work, bringing quantitative and qualitative methods together within the new fields of digital humanities and data science, celebratory accounts of the potentials for digital processes frequently overwrite these earlier histories of collection, ownership, and control. And I think this is very much what Seamus was also speaking to. It is, however, becoming more and more apparent that we might understand digital culture as also facilitating a grab of cultural material in ways, if not unprecedented, then I think reminiscent of the rapacious collecting that marked this era of imperial expansion and collection. And I'm being very kind of crude here, but just as ethnographic collections of the 19th century collected everyday life under the political and epistemological auspices of colonial disciplines, our everyday intimacies and creative outputs today are fast being absorbed by large corporations whose wealth is physically concentrated in tax havens and politically concentrated in very particular parts of the world. Instead of stripping copra, cotton, or gold out of the ground, corporations such as Facebook are abstracting personal data to create vast revenue streams, shifting data as a resource, increasingly also from the global south to the global north. And in this way, we replicate many of our past practices of collections. And it's now also recognized, I think, that social media itself is inherently archival, creating large and enduring data sets that are used as a baseline for algorithms that enshrine this historical material in order to make predictions that, rather than creating the brave new world that is often imagined, in fact magnify the past. Digital algorithms are some of the most powerful forms of both historical evidence and unacknowledged historiography that we have. In turn, the complex materiality of social media, as it shifts from words and images through screens and underground cables, data servers facilitated by massive amounts of electrical energy, metals and minerals, encapsulates some of the very existential questions that underpin contemporary collecting and the very function of museums. What are we collecting and who is it for? So I'm proposing that it's helpful to bring the history of ethnographic collecting and the critiques that have emerged within both scholarly and activist work on its colonial foundations into dialogue with our methodologies for understanding digital culture. And I just want to give you a quick example to finish, drawn from my own research and work in collaboration with people in Vanuatu, a Melanesian country in the South Pacific. Take, for instance, a conversation that I started, but which was sadly disrupted by COVID, with the Scandinavian Collecting Social Photography project and New York-based designers Michael Walters, when we tried to consider how to adjust the Collecting Social Photography web prototype for use with the Vanuatu Cultural Centre. Several issues emerged that challenged the cross-cultural suitability of some of the normative frameworks that structured this museum collecting initiative for social photography as a sub-part of social media. And they underscored how conservative understandings of high and low culture, of the cultural vernacular, and the definition of an object in museums were being magnified through this digitization project. I can just give one brief example. One of the most complicated aspects of navigating the movement of social media into the museum is the question of rights. And there's an emerging, very interesting triangulation between issues of ethical consent and rights that is emerging within both social research and museums. Within digital culture, the ways in which rights are increasingly registered as a form of private property, which focus on individuals as rights holders, for example. And as I've long written about in my work on Indigenous intellectual property, places like the Vanuatu Cultural Centre have developed a very complex categorization of rights to structure access to cultural collections. They are understood to reflect communal and traditional knowledge and the grassroots. And these rights are formulated, therefore, not at the level of the individual, but rather at the collective. And they might be structured according to gender, family affiliation, or connection to specific places. And I think that this is existential in digital projects. There is increasing conflict between a kind of identity-driven rights and the norms of public rights and citizenship that structure the National Museum and Archive. This emphasis on rights as a form of individually owned private property, rights as an object, in a sense, is also driving our ethical processes of consent and underscoring the ways in which our data is managed, say through GDPR or other data regulatory practices. And within the domain of social media, this becomes even more complex. Content is not public, even though it may be visible. It's private, but the platforms and data are corporately held, and there's a double black boxing of ownership, which moves us far beyond our regular conceptions of a shared public domain or a cultural commons. So what kind of ethnographic collection for the future might this be? The growing number of Indigenous databasing initiatives have been exploring how to translate these cultural protocols into digital rights management systems. And they also draw our attention to complex politics of knowledge that social media amplifies with its direct absorption of highly specific attitudes to intellectual property. This is very much Robin's work has focused on this. The lack of recognition for collective rights, other than the corporate collective of the platform, misses an opportunity to learn from debates about authorship and property rights that have long been taking place in relation to traditional knowledge. How to acknowledge, for example, the cultural or collective rather than simply ownership as an individual right, or to complicate the off-on binary between public and private. The aspirations of the ethnographic collection to capture and preserve the everyday practices of a distinct culture in order to understand the ways in which knowledge might be materialized or transmitted are therefore, I think, profoundly called into question with efforts to collect social media. At such a scale, how can we determine what is of value or whose voice to privilege? Who are we to make those decisions? Within the context of corporate ownership, intellectual property, or platform economies, how can this material ever be contained within museums? Are museums fit for purpose any longer? And in the context of rapid obsolescence and a culture of editing, revision, and deletion, how can we link this to museum discourses of conservation or preservation? So rather than try to answer these questions, because I have about a minute left, I just want to end, I think, with a kind of case study, an image to hold in mind. Try and share my screen very quickly. And I just want to kind of step outside of the institutional frameworks that we all are generally working within, and that are generally the starting point from which we then go into these conversations. I'd like to reverse that gaze and start here, which is a local archive that I've spent time in Vanuatu. And this photo was taken in 2018. And here is Lulu Sabosa in his personal archive and museum in the peri-urban village of Mele, which is just outside of Vanuatu's capital city, Port Vila. Lulu is a former primary school teacher, and he is an archivist par excellence. He has amassed an enormous collection of documents and images, some analog, some digital. Every day he writes up the events of the day, local, national, and global, in his own notebooks. He takes hundreds of photographs a week, documenting daily life in the village. And he has curated all of this in his own personal museum, which is a community resource in the village. I use his collection to highlight how, despite the interpenetration of digital culture in our daily lives, knowledge and collections will always extend beyond the digital form. And I think we need to remember this at all times. And at the same time, we also need to be mindful of how powerful the centralizing forces of national museums, libraries, and archives are, as they reach outside of their physical locations to influence vernacular collecting and image-making practices. These kinds of local archives have been produced in part in response to the global history of collecting that I was referring to earlier, and the role of museums in preserving and valorizing certain artifacts and histories. But they also emerge from parallel forms of archival sensibility that have been developed in alternative spaces. And these include the institutionalization of Christianity in the Pacific, which range from missionary hagiographies through to examples of artifacts of example, as well as the growing ubiquity of smartphones, photography, and social media that again provides an expressive and communicative medium within people's pockets, also heavily structured by global norms as well as local aesthetics. So rather than saying, is social media the next ethnographic collection, perhaps we need to start rather from that, instead of starting from the contents of Instagram or Facebook to theorize the power of social media to generate a new ethnographic collection, we can start from the other side, for example, by taking seriously the role of Pacific Islanders, not just as the content of archives or collections, but as archivists and collectors, curators and conservators. And in reversing this kind of heuristic or this gaze, we might then really start to reconceptualize the ethnographic collection and what it might be in the 21st century. Perhaps even better, working towards starting to think about what even decolonizing both our understandings of digital media and the museum might look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Excellent. Again, more food for thought, really good. I want to remind the attendees, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. We will, do our best to answer all of them. Some are being already answered in the chat anyway, but that's okay. We'll try and get them. We'll try and get questions to everybody. I've been writing down questions anyway, so everyone's going to get asked a question. That's for certain. Thank you, Heidi. I mean, can we? Okay, next person is someone who, interestingly, in his work on around digital histories, overlaps with my own quite a bit. Yet we've never met until today. Gerben Zaagsma is assistant professor at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg. He has a very diverse CV and a number of very interesting and diverse and overlapping research interests. But today, he's going to be talking to us about digital cultural heritage and the politics of digitization. Gerben, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction. Let me share the screen. I hope that is visible to to everyone like this. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this session today. What I'm basically going to do is a very condensed version of a talk that I've given a couple of times, mostly for audiences of historians and digital humanists. So I'm actually very, very happy to give it now for a broader audience, including a lot of heritage experts. So digital cultural heritage and the politics of digitization. As you will see, by the way, this will connect quite a bit, I think, especially to the talk of Seamus Ross. So what you see here is a picture of the Duke Humphreys Library at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. A very carefully selected and curated collection of books organized according to a specific classification scheme, which mediates the access to it. One of the factors that mediates access there, obviously not a neutral repository of knowledge or memory, as applies to archives and libraries in general. In fact, I think it's important to mention that libraries and archives are not simply purveyors of social or collective memory, as is quite often suggested, but they actually provide part of the raw material that feeds into its construction. But the point here is basically that what you can access and how you can access is all mediated through a number of factors that we will come back to a little bit later as well. Now, on this slide, you see the digital Bodleian, which provides easy access to a number of materials from the library that you saw on the previous slide without having to visit. You can access it all online. And note that here you have a different kind of order that is imposed through the way you can search, the way you can browse, the way you can access curated collections that you see on the bottom of this. So we have an increasing access to especially retro digitized sources. Today we have an online abundance of material that we have access to. When it comes to retro digitized, not so much more material. It's not more than what is available in archives or libraries, but of course it's easier accessible, and therefore we have this abundance. But that digitization, that online abundance does not mean completeness. Digitization is about selections. Archives and libraries, whether they're analog or digital, are not neutral, but they are repositories, as I already mentioned, of carefully selected and curated collections. So the question is why, where, and how can we access what we can access, and what are the stories that we can actually tell with online heritage? And why is this important for historians? Because more and more historians, especially the younger generation, turn to digital sources either completely or as complementary material. So the question then becomes, what are the politics of digitization and its implications for historical research? How then does digital cultural heritage affect historical research? And we know, of course, about the benefits and the opportunities that it provides us with, but what are actually the questions that historians need to ask and face when working with digitized cultural heritage? Some of those questions are, for instance, how does it influence research agendas? How does it shape what topics can be researched? But also, can it enable new research avenues that go beyond existing master narratives, or does it only function to reinforce those? Can it enable research into transnational histories when most digitization projects are in one way or another nationally framed? My own background is in modern Jewish history and Yiddish studies, and until a couple of years ago, there was very little Yiddish heritage online, which for historians of Jewish history is a problem, because the Jewish history in almost every country in the world is affected to a very large extent by migration, and Yiddish was the most important Jewish language before the Second World War. So again, in sum, what are the stories that we can tell with online heritage, and how can we address some of these challenges and questions that I've just mentioned? And this is important because historians and historical research practices are changing. A very interesting study by John Coburn of Newcastle University was published in the end of 2020. He called it Defending the Digital. And he was looking at how historians deal with what he called digital selectivity, basically awareness of critical issues regarding digital resources. And one of the interesting findings that he had in that research, he interviewed, I think, 5 or 6 historians, so not that many, but of different age groups. And the older historians clearly were used to browsing the archive in the sort of old-fashioned way, going to the archive, making serendipitous findings, but also by virtue of browsing through that archive, getting a good awareness of context. Whereas the early career researchers were much more inclined to talk about the benefits of keyword search and surgical discovery. And of course, especially that latter issue is quite a big change in terms of how how historians deal with their sources, especially when it comes to context. So having said that, very briefly about the state of digitization in the world, what you see here is a New Age of Culture, a study that was done a couple of years ago by the intelligence unit of The Economist to look at the global state of digitization. To my mind, the only recent study that tries to do that, and the only other study that I'm aware of, is the IFLA UNESCO study of 1999, a sort of global survey of digitization. What the Economist here has done is look at the states of cultural heritage digitization in 22 countries, using data obtained from 243 institutions, and then use a so-called cultural digitization scorecard to give a score about the state of digitization. That scorecard included not only digital reproduction of artifacts or documents, but also their online presence, web and mobile interaction with audiences, electronic access, and digital educational activities. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Europe and North America rank quite high, but it needs to be mentioned that, for example, China and Indonesia rank highly on archive digitization and access, whereas also access to cultural heritage in, for instance, Mexico and Peru and Thailand was assessed as quite good. So there is a bit of a varied picture there. Of course, in Western Europe, we are quite spoiled, I would say, when it comes to digitization. You see a graph here from the 2017 Enumerate survey, which to my mind is actually the last that has been done, and it's been taken over by the ECMAS consortium, if I'm not mistaken. And the key point of this slide is just to point out that when it comes to the digitization of cultural heritage in Europe, a lot of materials will actually never be digitized. And that's something that historians need to deal with, this balance between online and offline. Now, when we talk about the political dimensions of the politics of digitization, I always like to refer to the article, The Making of Memory by Richard Brown and Beth Davis Brown, around 20 years old, in which they outlined 4 key political dimensions of archival and curatorial work. You see them here in the left column. I'm not going to read completely through them, but it's about the allocation of collections. It's about the development of collections. It's about their classification and cataloging, and it's about circulation and access. And in the right column, I give what I think are their digital equivalents. So questions about which institutions digitize and control digital collections, what is actually digitized and why, what is metadated and not, and thus made accessible, how is it classified and how is it metadated, and also how is access provided and mediated. To go a little bit more into the question of selection, which I think is very important. Of course, we know that digitization is about selection and it's not neutral. There are a number of criteria usually involved. Preservation concerns, of course, easy access to collection highlights or often used materials, the research value of certain collections, academic research agendas, but also more broadly, memory politics, public discourses on the past, in various countries, national concerns. Of course, a lot of digital national libraries and archives aim to showcase their national heritage. And also in the case of Europeana, there is, of course, an aim to promote a sense of European identity by showing digitized heritage. And these criteria are reflected in funding patterns, but these criteria are not often made explicit. And that's actually where I come to almost my conclusion. So there are a couple of ways to deal with these challenges that I very, very sketchily have outlined. There's, of course, much more to say about this. We need to teach historians digital resource criticism and help them to better understand digital sources. Historians, I think, need to engage more also with the work of digital archivists and librarians, involving historians in co-designing the development of digital resource interfaces would be very helpful. But there's also another thing that I think we need to encourage, and that's what I've labeled a little bit pretentiously here, digital cultural heritage transparency guidelines. It would be very, very good if digital resources pay more attention to indicating how it was funded, what the selection criteria were for the materials that are included, how it's metadated and why, which scheme was used, how access is mediated, what choices were made in terms of providing the interface and the search options that are provided. And very, very importantly, also provide perhaps links to relevant offline sources so that historians get a much better sense of the sort of broad array of sources that could be used for the particular topic at hand, which is very nicely done very recently by the National Archive in the Netherlands. You see here a screenshot of the slavery collections page that they've created, where they list on the left a number of digitized archives, and on the right a number of slavery collections from other institutions, which are actually simply analog archival resources. But of course, this gives you a very, very nice overview of what is available if you're interested in slavery, and particularly the role of slavery of the Netherlands in the history of slavery. That's where I'm going to leave it now, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerben. That was very good. I mean, thank you also to all the speakers who have all been extremely timely. It's made my job very easy. I'd like to go, we have about a half an hour, and we have a number of questions, some quite long, and I'd like to go basically speaker by speaker, so each speaker has a chance to respond to at least some questions about their talk, so everyone gets a chance at a shot at that. So if I can go back to Rossitza. Rossitza has a lot of questions, so it's kind of hard to choose, but I think I will choose first Katharina, who has asked Rossitza, I would be interested in your work with focus groups to define needs for digitization. Staying with your example, how did you find out there was a demand for the newspapers?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Definitely, particularly the Heritage My Digital digitization, newspaper digitization strand had ensured that there was an advisory board which involved interested academics, users who would kind of soundproof our selection of newspapers. We also were aware of some research projects, I think a Leeds-based project, other projects in the UK that were interested in us digitizing particular newspaper titles. So there was quite an extensive engagement with the research community to identify the needs to select for digitization, which this is the first library own funded digitization. So we used our grant in aid, the money we received from the government, to pay salaries, run projects internally, support kind of business as usual activities. We used that money to establish a team that would look at the standardization of the workflows, the different aspects, document standards, make everything more transparent and streamlined within the library. We also use some of the money to digitize newspapers that were of interest to our users, and in particularly academic users, as well as collections, as I mentioned, that have not been didn't previously attract funding, or the library wanted to digitize for reasons such as poor condition, vulnerability, making sure that there's representation of non-Western languages. So we decided to digitize manuscripts from the Christian Orient. So the Western manuscript digitization at the British Library very early on adopted consultation again with the user community through their blog posts. So they used to pre-select material for digitization and approach the online community for feedback. And so they were able to then prioritize certain manuscripts depending on the feedback they got. So we've always had that kind of two-way dialogue where we were more in control of the funding. And then, of course, when we work with partners, what we've done is that we've always tried to, and even more so now, try to find what's in common, of common interest to both partners. For instance, our partnership with the National Library of France or the National Library of Singapore. Also we are trying to influence more the selection around digitization as part of research projects. So we've recently had a lot of interest in digitizing Malay manuscripts, palm leaf manuscripts, and we try to ensure that collections are not fragmented. So we try to digitize complete runs of newspapers, for example, as long as we don't violate copyright, complete collections, so we don't allow people to cherry pick. We work together with researchers who are interested in us digitizing collections to support their research in defining the selection and the scope of the digitization, and also making them aware of all the challenges which everyone spoke about in terms of, limitations around metadata. So some of our collections are not cataloged, so we need to attract some funding towards cataloging, but also think creatively about maybe using digital ways of creating metadata more quickly rather than long descriptions before we could start a digitization, before we can then make things accessible. And identifying collections in different languages. We realized that for a lot of our printed books, we didn't have language codes in our catalog records. So a member of the metadata team very quickly through statistical methods managed to do analysis for 3 million records, I think, of early printed books to define based on words within the titles and publication places to define the language, which was then, the data was then proofread by the curators. Titles were looked at if there was any questions around what language it was, and then the language code was imported into the catalog, and that allows us then to select, say, books in a certain language that hasn't been underrepresented for digitization at a later stage.
Rossitza, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yes,
I want to get you to a second question.
Yes.
And we have to make sure there's plenty of time for everyone else. It's a nasty job, but I...
Oh yeah, of course. No, sorry. That's your job, yes.
Because there's another excellent question here by Nicole McNally. And she asks you to expand more on the activities and impact of the anti-racism group in the BL on digital descriptions and their broader work.
Okay, so the project started last year and it's still in its early stages. There has been a blog post, so I will share the link in a minute to the blog post, which talks about the activities which we're looking at. The library has ensured that a lot of the networks within the library, as well as the curators responsible for the collections, everyone in the library is able to have input into this project. But it's looking at things like collection practice, acquisition, exhibitions and engagement, also the quality of metadata. So our metadata department is working with curators, cataloging different collections, also working on digitization projects like the Qatar Digitization Partnership to review the catalog standards we use. For examples, we are applying now fast subject headings, which are a bit more flexible than the Library of Congress subject headings and allow for kind of more appropriate maybe terminology to be used to describe collection items. We are reviewing problematic and offensive terminology that has been used to describe collections. So these are the type of activities. We are also very, very, very aware that algorithms, artificial intelligence can introduce bias. So any of the projects where we're working with machine learning and we're supporting research projects which are using machine learning, we are kind of educating ourselves and ensuring that any training data is kind of representative of the library collections, but improving metadata quality and reviewing our collection acquisitions and also, as I mentioned, selection for digitization are some of the activities of the anti-racism project. I will share a link now to the blog post, and perhaps you want to move to another question, Robin.
Yeah, I mean, actually it's good time, but yes, I think we probably should move on to make sure everybody has their time. Thank you, Rossitza. Two excellent questions, by the way. If we could move on now to Seamus, and I have a lot of good questions, but I think I'm going to ask the ones from Christina Rio. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Christina, who asked you two questions, but they kind of come together in the final one. So she would like to know, don't we put too much weight on AI and technological advance in contrast with other still important classical activities?
Well, thank you. That's a great question, but it's a little difficult to answer very concisely because I actually think we don't put enough emphasis on AI. AI has a tremendous potential to help us to better understand and improve access to collections. And yes, it's true. We've heard in the last presentation about the biases that exist, and we heard, and Heidi mentioned them as well. But I think that there are many ways that we can move beyond that. And as we develop more and more effective, and particularly deep learning and machine learning algorithms, we can do much, much more to understand our collections, to benchmark them, to decide what to digitize, decide what needs to be redigitized because there's material that is not accessible. And we'll also be able to use these techniques and tools for datafication. That is the conversion of, it's particularly in the humanities, content, digitized content, into mechanisms, that, forms that we can more easily manipulate it in digital forms. So I think that AI has much underappreciated potential. I do recognize, I teach a course on the ethics of human-centered data science, which focuses very heavily on artificial intelligence and machine learning. I do recognize the ethical downsides and the ethical challenges, but I would actually argue that those ethical challenges are not the product of machine learning or artificial intelligence itself, but actually the product of the humans who design the algorithms, the humans who design the data sets that we train the algorithms on. In fact, perhaps eliminating the human from some of the equation might result in more effective and more efficient machine learning algorithms and AI systems that would produce far better tools for understanding our collections, for engaging, for example, in descriptive processes for creating, say, for example, finding aid descriptions, which, because if we can control the AI systems, we can control the biases. And so I'm very positive about the potential of AI. And I suppose that really goes back to the fact that it's nearly 40 years ago that I was first interested in the application of knowledge-based systems to the process of developing systems in archaeology for the automated identification of artifacts. So I have a long interest in the positive sides of it. But that's not to suggest that there aren't downsides that we need to take into account.
Thank you, Seamus. So I hope that people don't mind. I mean, there's not really any other questions. Question has been asked and answered. I'd like to ask Seamus a question, if I may, because we have a little bit of time here. Quick question. It's not very quick, but that's okay. We'll have to make it quick. Seamus, we're here to talk about social impact. And one problem with measures of social impact, which you brought up multiple times in your talk, are that they tend to support and reinforce current practice, key audiences and elite stakeholders. How do you think social impact measures could be used to challenge these hegemonies and empower new, often marginalized audiences and stakeholders?
Well, I'm actually sorry here that I didn't have to draw up very quickly the, just give me 1 second here.
And also remind you, we only have 3 minutes, but it's okay.
Yeah, sorry. I think that one valuable lesson valuable tool set we can turn to actually is the Europeana impact playbook. And there's two areas that I would pick up from that playbook that I think are particularly good at helping us to understand the impact of digitization. One is to look at the strategic perspectives and to look at the value lenses. The value lenses are what's the utility, what's the learning potential learning outcomes, what kind of legacy are we creating, what kind of communities are we building with the material. And from a strategic perspective, we can ask questions about the economic, the social, the kinds of innovation that actually it brings about. And one huge aspect, which is really constrained in terms of rights issues, is the possibilities for remixing. In Canada, we have a copyright exemption which supports, within certain constraints, the use of digital content for generation of user-generated content, and we have very, very powerful, fair dealing, what they call in the U.S. fair use guidelines in our Copyright Act, which allow us to use content much more flexibly for innovation than many of the copyright directives in Europe would actually support. There's some very good articles about this, if anyone's interested. So for me, we need to look at, we can take the impact playbook from Europeana and use that to ask questions. If I were to suggest one other area, we should be asking, how is our collections being used for social justice purposes? And what kind of social innovations are digital collections actually bringing about? I hope that helps.
Yes, excellent. I mean, thank you, Seamus. Good, and we're very much on time, which is good. I'd like to move on quickly to Heidi. Heidi has a lot of very good questions here. I'm going to start with, though, Katarina's, where she asks you, could co-ownership be a solution to not only build up trust, but also enable the establishment of a collection of online social media content as proposed by you in the beginning?
Hi, yeah, I've been thinking about that question. I think, yes, absolutely, because what comes with ownership is an allocation of authority or power around decision making. And we also have to think about what kinds of relationships ownership, different models of ownership create. So something like co-ownership, which would distribute that decision making authority or capacity, and which would allow for ongoing relationships to be developed and built, exactly like you say, around developing trust. I think it's a really productive mechanism for solving some of these issues, for sure. So yeah. It says Nicole is going to answer this question live.
Oh, how nice. Yes, that's really good. I'm also, because there's also a question from Kostas Dallas, and I'm actually sending it to you.
I had a look at it. I saw it in the chat. That was the one.
Okay, it's a very, yes, he's already apologized for it being a very long one. So
another really great question.
Yeah, I'll read it out for everybody else who might have seen it in the chat anyway, but social media are inherently archival. I find this idea intriguing in its potential, especially in light of the huge practical resistance of platforms to archival attention and access. I am reminded of the work of two of the speakers in tomorrow's afternoon session. Anat Ben David call for a counter-archiving movement with regard to social media data, and Hert Lovink's notion of stackertivism. I wonder how much existing connective practices of what I call digital curation in the wild already reclaim platform agency and the logic of networks, and subvert to the logic of networks. And then he goes on again, and if so, is there a pragmatic lesson here for collecting institutions and aggregators such as Europeana?
I mean,
I read that quick.
That I've been mulling that question over since it was put in the chat. I think that you're using the word archival in two different ways. So when you're saying that there's a kind of resistance of platforms to archival attention, I think you're using the word archive to mean the kinds of archive for public good and for the public kind of storage and preservation of knowledge, which then is kind of stymied by the black boxing of the platforms in corporate social media. But they are themselves also forms of archive, because they fundamentally depend upon their galvanizing and collecting and storage of information, which just is then made available or accessible in according to a different logic. So the question, I think, is not really about whether there's a kind of wild or not wild. It's really about what can come out of the kind of friction between these two very powerful archival logics. And that's what I was trying to get at and what I was saying. And I think sometimes and what I was arguing was they may not be as different as they seem, in as much, and it goes back to Katerina's question, that the logic of state archives is similarly as black boxed for many people and similarly oppressive or exclusionary for many people around the world. So I think we have to watch this kind of, assumption that there is sort of this, the national archive or the public archive is good and corporate archive is bad, because I think they share many characteristics. And then what I was trying to kind of get at, I'm sorry if it was too dense for the short time I had, by showing the personal archive of Lulu in Vanuatu, is that both these imaginaries are then being reproduced all the time in the wild. So again, I think it's a mistake to think of activist work or what you're referring to as in the wild, I'm assuming vernacular, non-institutionalized grassroots activities, as completely divorced from these logics, because they are often very invested in those logics. They're reproducing them often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes perhaps less consciously, but they're very engaged. I mean, the category of the archive has tremendous valence and power and authority that people often want to grab onto for themselves. So I'm not sure. So I think there's this huge feedback loop going on around all of these activities that make it very complicated to try to unravel, unpick, and find the right model or the right way. I suppose where I am at the moment is just trying to understand what happens when you take away our assumptions and actually identify the kinds of practices and processes and ideologies and intentions that are going on in all of these different contexts, and then try to figure out how they can best serve, do something good, do something for the good of most people. But even that in itself is a very fraught kind of value system for many populations around the world. That doesn't answer the question. I suppose we could talk about what the logic of network is, maybe. I wasn't quite certain about what you meant with that.
Kostas, you might, let's see here. No, I don't see Kostas coming back with that. It's a very good question. As a matter of fact, that leads, we have a little bit of time, so I may ask a question if that's all right. Putting you on the spot, Heidi, but okay, this is I found this your talk a really interesting counterpoint to the ethnographic work that has been a cornerstone of both media studies and sociology of science for some time now. And their forms of ethnography, which is not exactly the same kind of anthropological ethnography, I grant you, nor the same subjects either. But I'm thinking here primarily, though not exclusively, of the works of Stefania Malan or Susan Lee Starr. So my question, there's a question. My question is, can your call for reversal of the gaze and decolonization constructively engage with the work of these other disciplines who are engaged in a very, well, at least at the political level, in a very similar program?
I mean, I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek when I used the word decolonization, because I think that's a kind of easy out or easy way to position some of these debates without really kind of having done the hard work of figuring out what the coloniality that is still so powerfully present in all of this, actually. So I probably wouldn't sit under that heading in terms of an aspiration at the moment, because I think it's a bit hubristic. I mean, I think absolutely that this works across all of these different disciplines. I suppose the ethnographic or the anthropological is to continually remind us of that kind of decentering move that anthropologists make, which is that there's always another place from which you can look at these questions. And that isn't often foregrounded in some of the literature that you discussed, that you were referring to. But so I think I still think there's a value that can come from that move. That is also this reminder. So I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to show a photo of a person in my talk is also that we talk in these abstracted levels, and we talk in these kind of very institutionally framed ways, and sometimes we lose sight of the people that actually we need to work with and what they think and what they are actually doing, which is often not what we think they want or are doing, actually. So there's a question of scale there, of analysis as well, and maybe that these are compatible and are all needed together. So I think that there is a compatibility, but there isn't kind of always that much of overlap. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, we have to leap forward very quickly. The press of time is on us, and I'd like to give Gerben a moment to answer a question as well. There were none for Gerben from the floor, but I had one, which is quite appropriate because it is about time. So to carry on Heidi's point. So Gerben, if I may ask you, your Bodleian image, caught my eye immediately. The very first image you had, not only because I actually have a collection of images of archives and libraries from the 18th century well into the 20th century, all of which reproduce that view. Every single one of them is just a copy of that. The flowing walls along are different for each library, but it's exactly that gaze. And I have dozens of them. and of course, this is time-made material, which is the classic manifestation of the archive, right? Material, you know, the manifold model of the archive. So how do you think, this is my question, that the program of digitization flattens this kind of manifest model of the archive of time that has traditionally framed archives and libraries? I'm thinking here a lot of Seamus's point about how historic infrastructure continues to block progress and innovation. And I would include this kind of gaze within that infrastructure. So how do you think that digitization does flatten that? Does it break that apart? Or are we suffering in digitization with the same gaze?
It's a very good question. Thank you. I think it depends how digitization is handled. Sometimes digitization tries to recreate the respect des fonds, the respect de l'ordre, the original order of traditional archives, which of course in themselves are constructed, power laden, etc., etc. Sometimes it combines that with new types of classifications. But every classification is again a construct, and I guess the whole point of my talk is to make those constructions more transparent. What I find very exciting is experiments such as the Mukutu content management systems, where the attempt is actually being made to turn that rather to break with that sort of arguably more Western tradition and look at indigenous knowledge structures and approaches and try to recreate that in a context of a digital cultural heritage system. But it depends very much on the resource one is dealing with, how that works out, I would say. Yeah.
I mean, kind of carrying on from, because we have a few moments here, carrying on from Heidi's points again. I mean, about bringing the, you know, coming back in and literally, you know, going back to art, you know, allowing the grassroots, if you will, of the indigenous, all problematic terms, to become the archivists. Do you see from your perspective, and especially a historical perspective, or within your research within Jewish history, of how digitization can, like in Kim Kristen's work or in Ito Asunori's work from Japan, can decenter that archival power?
I find it difficult to say. One of the key issues, of course, in Jewish history is always the dispersal of source materials, and digitization then can very often function to bring together materials that are spread out in various locations in the world. There's a key mass digitization project going on now by the YIVO Institute for Historical Research in New York that aims to bring together the New York and the Lithuanian holdings and reunite them virtually. Is that decentering? I'm not sure, but it's definitely doing something that transcends the boundaries of traditional archiving. The same is true for certain Jewish digital newspaper archives that actually do the same thing. So in that sense, it does decenter. Yeah, that one could say that.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time now, but that's an excellent place to end, of course, with the you know, the idea of that hasn't been brought up today much, I don't think. So we could leave with Gerben's point about reassembly.
Yeah.
The empowerment of reassembly of you know, of dispersed cultural heritage, which is such a central issue for so many communities around the world. So we've now hit our limit within seconds. Thank you to all of our speakers, to Rossitza, to Seamus, to Heidi, and to Gerben, for being so timely, being so challenging, causing us to think. And thank you to all of our attendees who have come and contributed excellent questions and been patient with us while we've managed to do this. Thank you also, of course, to our Europeana team who have organized this and pulled this off with great finesse. Thank you all.